This video will demonstrate the calibration procedure for gauge blocks. Gauge blocks are cleaned using naphtha and allowed to dry and cool overnight in the lab. This particular video demonstrates the flatness test for the surface of a gauge block. We're using a monochromatic light in conjunction with a Van Kuren optical flat. The optical flat right now is showing that the face of the gauge block is extremely flat. The interference bands don't cross or bend, they're nice and parallel. Each interference band represents 11 microinches of distance. In the event that a nick or a burr is noted on the gauge block when it's examined under the monochromatic light, utilize the small Starrett gauge block polishing stone. Place the gauge block on the stone, and this is done dry with no lubrication. Make gentle figure 8 motions with the gauge block, applying gentle pressure. And as the burr is removed, suddenly the gauge block will no longer feel a drag as you move it across the stone. At that point, remove the stone, re-examine under monochromatic light, and make sure it's nice and flat. This video demonstration will show how to calibrate gauge blocks at Boise Calibration Service. We calibrate gauge blocks to the federal standard of GGG-G-15C, single point measurement. We establish our reference point utilizing our square Mitutoyo gauge block set and set the probe for the center of the logo and the size on the front, and it's also centered between the front edge and the back hole. On this particular gauge block, it's a 1/2 inch block. The data from Mitutoyo shows that it's long by 2.8 microinches. So what we do is we set the offset for 2.8 microinches, and in this case we'll round up to 3 and establish that reference point. Remove this gauge block, place the customer's gauge block up here, and since it's a rectangular block, we set it in the center of the rectangle. Like so. And we can see that it's got an offset of about +1 microinch. One thing that's very important to do is to wear the full face shield while you're doing gauge block calibration. Otherwise, as you're working, just your normal breathing will heat up the gauge block standard and then also the gauge blocks themselves, and repeatability will become a real problem. When we measure gauge blocks, each block is done an intercomparison of 3 separate times, and then those readings are averaged out, and that's the data that's put onto the data sheet for the customer.